So, on this episode of Full Stack Engineering, let's talk about getting into code and into programming. Today we've got John Cotton. And John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do on the side?
Yeah, so I work as an engineer during the day, but then I've been mentoring just as a volunteer for actually about the past 4 years now. We had a local Elixir meetup, and it was kind of originally like your traditional Elixir group. And after running it for a while, the organizers wanted to be more focused on mentoring. And so Bruce Tate and Groxio kind of stepped in as sort of like the facilitator and provided a little bit of a platform to get students and have access to some training materials. And a handful of other mentors, myself, we've just been kind of getting together once a week and doing maybe a little bit of instructor-led stuff, but a lot of what we cover is actually based on the interest of the mentees that come every week. So we just kind of try to be there and be supportive and show up and really just listen to what they want to work on and try to keep them unblocked as they learn to program.
Just to clarify there too, because you're kind of doing a boot camp type thing. And so is there a certain level of knowledge or experience that somebody already has to have coming into that? Or can you come in from ground zero?
Maybe to clarify, it's not really a boot camp. It really is like pretty informal, but it is really an open door. It's focused on people who are underrepresented in the community. And we really take anybody, like as long as they want to come and learn. And it's kind of an open door policy. Like if it makes your life better, keep coming. If it doesn't, you don't have to worry about it. We have a few people that are just straight up beginner, learning how to understand even the concept of coding. And then we have other folks who maybe have started somewhere else and want to just specifically learn Elixir and the tools around Elixir.
That leads into an interesting place here. So out of all the options available, a couple of them being, say, college, so getting a CS degree, going the boot camp route where you're paying less than college, but you're paying not an insignificant amount of money to basically do kind of like a workshop program to go through and get experience in an accelerated period of time to code, or going the self-taught route where you basically pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You mentioned kind of something that's a little different than all of those, where this is kind of like a mentorship route. So it's kind of like a blend between boot camp and self-taught, where you're kind of doing your own thing, but you're able to get together with a group of people and get some guidance on where to go next, what to learn next, things like that. But it sounds like it's also not you're going to learn to code and get a job in like 3 months type of deal, right?
Yeah. I think some of our success stories involve people who are already doing some type of education and they're looking for like more of a mentorship aspect to that. And some of our success stories are really interesting. We had a mentee give a talk at ElixirConf, Kimberly Johnson. It was self-taught to first job. And I want to say it was about 1.5 to 2 years for her to go through that. And really, I think that's not a bad expectation if you're very serious about it. And she was super serious.
Based on like all the paths that you have available today to learn to code, to be able to get into the industry, what type of pathway would you recommend for somebody looking to make that switch?
Yeah, I've actually had a little bit of time to think about this, and I'm sure you have different opinions too. But actually, something very interesting is there's learning to code, and then there's learning to code professionally for the job. And the difference between those is like subtle, right?
I don't know if I'd say subtle.
Can you code with other people versus can you build a thing by yourself given no time constraints whatsoever? You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, maybe it's not quite so subtle, but like, I don't know that it's obvious that like, the difference between doing something as a hobby and doing something professionally, and you can do something, just because you are interested in doing it and pursue it as a hobby versus it has to be tied to a profession.
That's a very good distinction. So what would you say is the difference in mindset between doing it as a hobby and doing it professionally?
Yeah, that part might be a little bit more subtle because you can be very professional about your hobby. And I know several people who very much are. A lot of the people who are really good coders that might say like, oh, I'm not a programmer. But then it's like you see what they've done and it's very clear. That being said, there's really no rules, right? If you just want to learn something for fun, whatever the best advice you can get from somebody. I actually think I steal your advice a lot of times, Alex, which is solve a problem that's interesting to you. That's a big door opener. And then as far as learning professionally, it's that plus focusing on the skills that make you a professional. I was thinking earlier about like the difference between like maybe just software, like developing software and then being a software engineer. And I think that is like maybe where I'd start to draw the professional distinction. Engineering is more of an art and a science. I think we can kind of collectively as a community agree upon a lot of the sort of norms and rules around trying to build responsible software. And I think that is maybe something that you really want to be focusing on if you want to do it professionally.
So what if I were to throw out there that one of the most important things, maybe the most important thing for developing software professionally is being able to deliver?
It's something that I've seen as a blocker to some, I think, because some developers or some people that are trying to come into the field, they somehow have it inside of their minds that everything that they must deliver has to be perfect. Some of that might come from like imposter syndrome, but because of that, they end up in this churn cycle where they're just refactoring, and it's like this never-ending loop. I've seen that a few times, and it's something that is difficult to break them out of because they're mainly doing it because they just don't feel like it's perfect enough, right? We have to be okay with finding that balance of quality work versus perfect work and be able to deliver that to whomever or whatever, because it's always about the value that you bring to the table.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Being able to consistently deliver solutions. Some of that can be learned as far as managing trade-offs and learning like when enough is enough. That's kind of a learned skill, and it may depend on the team you're working on. So some of these development skills are based on the team that you're on and your culture. But yeah, I think I would say I agree that the main difference between a professional and maybe a novice or a hobbyist is the ability to deliver consistently.
I think you touched on another good point too. That's being able to work with other people. And so that's one of the big differences that I've seen both coming from the hobby route and professional route. It's not all just about the code that you can write yourself. It's about how you can work with other engineers as well as other people on your team. So product managers, designers, and to a certain extent, if you're doing consulting too, how well you can work with your client. So that's a big hurdle that I've seen from people who come from a background of, I'll say, less experience, air quotes, less experience, because some of that consulting experience is a whole nother angle of that. You can be the best programmer in the world at writing code, but that doesn't mean you're good at dealing with somebody yelling at you for creating something in a way that didn't necessarily match their vision or that they weren't expecting. So there's that whole like expectation setting side of things. What's your experience been around those soft skills and being able to deal with other people?
Having spoken to a lot of developers and with those that I mentor, they've definitely mentioned that coming out of the college experience and moving into an actual role at a product company or consultancy or whatever, the course work misses those soft skills. Like there's a huge gap when it comes to like working with others, working in a project, managing a project, and what that life cycle actually looks like. I've definitely heard that a few times. And well, if the institutions aren't really doing a very good job teaching it, then is it really fair to learn that on the go, on the fly, as you start your professional career?
Yeah, I would agree. I would actually say I did learn those things in college, but I learned them in a different context. I studied mass communications, and I learned some of those skills doing television and film projects, which is collaborative, and it's a different form of agile that doesn't necessarily get the label. I would agree that in my experience and with the people I've worked with from our local university here, the degree and kind of the training around it does not really do a lot of focus on some of the skills that are used in the workplace.
So speaking of that, we all have similar experience in that none of us actually went to college for programming. Okay, what did you do, Avelino?
I did some college, but I ended up dropping out as soon as I had the fundamentals and got a job.
Yeah, we don't need to go into my background. I think I did that on another podcast here. What's the value of, or is there any value still these days in going and getting a CS degree versus going another route?
The other routes that come to mind are bootcamp, self-taught, and that's about it. At least that come to my mind. I strongly believe that all you really need is discipline and drive, and also like learning how to learn. From the coursework that I received and from the stories that I get secondhand from people that I mentor that have actually finished a CS degree, the coursework is actually pretty light. It doesn't go in depth, and throughout the course of me speaking with these developers, I mentioned, well, if there's something that you feel they lack or some of your understanding falls short, well, it's really up to you to gather the resources and learn some of that stuff on your own. Because if you really want to succeed as an engineer, as a developer, then you must become really well acquainted with all these core concepts. And not only that, but there's always something that's going to pop up in the field that you don't know. It's really up to you to figure it out, demystify it, learn it, and deliver. And having said that, I really do think that it's really up to the individual walking that path, but it's also a bit unfair because they don't know. And so, like, for example, boot camps, they take advantage by saying, hey, we're going to teach you all this in 6 months and you're going to be a professional React developer. But it's really an intro to React 101, if you will, because there's so much that they can teach you in 6 months. And there's also so much that you can absorb in 6 months. And so most of the time, at least the way that I learned, I really have to get in there and write some code, repeat it a few times so that it sinks in and I either get that muscle memory or I actually understand it after a few rewrites or refactors or whatever. That's just how I work. Everyone works differently and you really must figure out how it is that you best work. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all here approach, but there's a lot of work in terms of the research that you have to do to figure out your path, because obviously you just have to build out your curriculum and be disciplined and have that drive to actually go through all those steps to reach your destination there.
I want to just plus one something that you said, which was around meta learning. And really, like, software engineering is a field where you need to really hone your meta learning skills. And that's learning how you learn. And that's a skill that doesn't get taught anywhere. It doesn't get taught in college. That is typically something that you learn outside of the traditional field of education. Like they don't teach it in our local school system here. And then the other part is really like the unknown unknowns that you face as a sort of fledgling developer. And that is maybe a really hard place to be because there are plenty of loudspeakers with ads of sorts trying to tell you the way. You kind of have to find which voices, mentors, brands, they're going to give you good advice that you can kind of trust. But it really is like you're kind of left to who you trust, like which voices you trust early on. That is maybe just a responsibility call to other people who've kind of gotten into the field to give sound advice and know that maybe it's worth taking that moment to help somebody and give them like just a little bit of course setting, depending on what they want to do, because you could really go the wrong path or potentially get really burnt out from changing directions a lot of times.
You touched on something really important, and that's learning to learn. And I definitely had to go over that learning curve, but I did it intentionally, and it's paid off very, very well. That is something that I don't see taught anywhere, and it is something that seems hard for people to pick up on. And to a certain extent, I think the college route almost discourages that in a sense. You're on a grading system, and they're really encouraging you to get A's. Everyone wants to get an A in the class. Everyone wants to have the highest GPA, whatever. Everyone wants to do the best. But at the end of the day, that letter grade is actually subjective. It's not objective. It's what your professor thinks, how well you agree with them, in a sense. So there's a bit of a trap there. And also part of that grade is, are you repeating the correct answers of the past? And now some of those fundamentals don't change very much, and they are really important to know. But especially in engineering and in software engineering in particular, anything that's on the cutting edge of technology, the right answer to something isn't necessarily fixed at a point in time. The right answer to things change. And so if you're repeating yesterday's right answer, it's not necessarily the right answer today. And if you bring that mentality into, again, the professional world, if you take that into, actually having to deliver and actually having to do things right and actually having to build a scalable product that works for millions of users and stuff like that. If you only go off of what you're told and you don't do your own thinking and you don't do your own evaluation, that can actually be a really big trap to where you build something that on paper seems like it's going to be correct. but in practice fails horribly. So that was one of the most freeing things that I probably learned in college, was going from being an A student to being okay getting Fs. That was a very scary experience. But after going through it, very freeing. And then dropping out. So there is a certain point where if you're going the self-taught route, don't be stupid about carving your own path. But if you do carve your own path, and it's going to take a lot of work, but if you do that, you can end up with insights and experience and completely different perspectives from how everybody else sees things. You can end up solutioning better. And to tie that back to one of the things Abelino said, in a professional world, that can make you very valuable.
Do you think that people choose boot camps or CS just because it's an easier choice?
Honestly, yes. I think it's the FIRE, financial independence, retire early route applied to programming. Boot camps on the surface look like a very easy way to shortcut experience, essentially. Well, there's another thing that they shortcut to. They shortcut the college way of doing it. So you can do something that would normally take you 4 years. You can do it in 6 months-ish. So there's two aspects of that. And I think the vision of a boot camp is really the former rather than the latter. I think they're really pitching this as, look, you can get this awesome high-paying programming job in 6 months and be this complete expert, and you'll be totally awesome at programming. Like Abelino said earlier, no, you won't be. But also, and that's okay. That should be the other part of that message, and that's okay. You'll have a lot more learning to do from here out of the gate, but eventually you'll get there if you keep putting the work into it. So that's the part that I don't necessarily like about boot camps, is I think they pitch the wrong vision. I think they're intentionally not very honest about that. I don't think there's any better way to put that. That being said, if you go into a boot camp knowing the boot camp game, you can definitely get a lot out of it. You can do a lot with your career. If you compare a boot camp to college, do you need to spend 4 years on a degree these days? And do you need all the CS fundamentals and all that stuff taught formally? At the end of the day, it depends on what you're getting into. But for most jobs, like Abelino mentioned, like if you're going to write React all day and you're going to be developing UI and visual components and stuff like that, do you need to know set theory and your whatever, all the other CS stuff? No, you don't. You just need to know enough CSS to make the stuff look pretty on the screen, right? That's all you really need to know. And you need to be able to deliver that on a quick timeline. If you can do that, you'll be successful doing that type of work.
You may learn it's not for you.
That's another good one too. Yeah, exactly.
Or just that you'd rather do something else.
Yeah, totally. That's another good one. And that's a really good reason where trying out coding on the side as a hobby is a really good way to see if it's for you in the first place. I would say don't jump into a boot camp, and honestly, I'd say don't jump into a college course doing it until you've tried it on the side and see if you like it. I've been programming since I was a kid, and so I got a taste for it for a long time and didn't go into a CS program. I circled back around and now I'm doing CS, but I was like, no, I don't want to spend my money on that. So the other side of this is, what professions do you actually need a degree in these days? And there are some, like you probably want your doctor to have a degree, but is it going to be okay to start coding without a CS degree? And in some cases, no, but probably in most cases, yes.
Yeah, the barrier to coding now, right? Like, so getting to a computer, getting like to a physical computer used to actually be a hard thing to do, right? So a CS degree would be a great way to get into a computer lab, or really anything close to that, right? Like if you want to be near a computer, if you want to touch a computer, that's not a problem anymore. The barriers to being able to write code and to write programs and to learn are actually pretty much all gone. It's now the opposite problem. It's now, given the sort of ever increasing information available, how do you learn to set yourself on a good path?
Yeah, that's such a good point too, because nowadays you can pop open a web browser and hop onto a coding sandbox and test stuff out there. Learning to learn has another aspect to it. I think ties back into being okay with making mistakes. And that's a really important thing that you definitely don't get taught in college, because we went through the grade system. You're encouraged to get A's. If you're not getting A's and you're falling down on that scale, you're doing it wrong, right? You're making a mistake. But mistakes are a natural part of learning. And I think that also plays back into learning to learn. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to do things that look like they're failures when you're learning to learn. But it's not about those individual successes and failures. It's really about the experience that you're getting when you're doing that. Every time you succeed or fail, you're gaining experience in an area. You typically have more to learn from your failures than your successes. So failures in this case aren't necessarily bad things. And that's something that you can bring over to that professional programming environment a lot, is being okay running spikes and experiments and things like that to see what works and what doesn't, and being okay with whatever results come out of that and taking those results objectively to be able to make a good rational decision on how you should move forward, rather than being attached to history or your opinions or things like that of, well, so-and-so in my CS course said you do things this way, and this is the one true way to write code, so we need to do that. Or open source author or famous programmer or whatever says you need to do things this way, therefore we have to do things by the book that way. Like, there's an element of that where you really need to adapt to things and figure out what's the right tooling, approach, solutions to what I'm doing right now.
I think there's just something to be said for discovering a way not to do something. Like finding things that don't work is a good iterative step. If you think of writing as a process and you think of it as an iterative process, it's kind of understood that you're going to learn things along the way and learn to do things better. And you're not going to necessarily know how to do something the best way in the moment. And so you may have to settle for just a way that works, that meets enough requirements and doesn't introduce enough evil into the code base that you can live with until you know how to do it better. It's software. So tomorrow, when you wake up and you have a better idea, you can change it and you can learn together with your teammates why that's a better choice.
It's good to be able to take an iterative approach to what you're solutioning. So you don't need to come at a problem of, oh, this one grand idea is going to fix all of our problems and everything is going to work 100% perfectly and, that kind of thing. Because just like your own experience, your software, your project, the problem you're solving is evolving along the way too. And this is a good example of the differences between when you're initially launching a project. So like a greenfield product that's brand new, you might have a very small user base versus a scaled out product once it actually reaches millions of users. And the solution for the small greenfield product is not the same solution typically for the scaled out product. And so there's a natural evolution there, that you go through. And this process is also like sculpting in a sense, where take a block of the material you're sculpting, and I kind of look at coding like this, start chipping away at things till it kind of gets the way you want it to look like. It's not going to be 100% perfect, but there's a point where it'll kind of start taking shape and kind of start getting the job done. Start rolling with that and see how it works. And then based on how you see that and you're receiving feedback from the ecosystem it's in, and this kind of goes back to the learning to learn, you might start realizing, oh, the idea that I originally had for this in my head isn't going to quite work out the way I thought that it was going to. So let's make a little change over here and a little change over there, and then deploy that and see how that goes. And so you're kind of chipping away at these little pieces here and there. And eventually you end up getting to that polished, nice looking solution. But you don't have to start with it.
One thing that definitely resonated with me, John, is you mentioned solutioning with your teammates. We all come from a culture of pair programming, and so on a daily basis, we are okay with reaching out, asking for help, brainstorming, so on and so forth. And that's definitely something that developers learning the trade early on need to shed, and that is the misconceptions around asking for help. It does not look poorly on you. It is not something to not do because you think that they're going to look at you differently or think that you're dumb. No, it's the exact opposite. It's about learning together, growing together, and delivering something beautiful in the end.
Yeah, that touches on the whole mentoring topic too. That circles back to that as well. If you're going to go the self-taught route, what are some of those ways that you succeed by doing that?
I guess I'd be curious to ask each of you, what is one thing that's worked for you?
So before you try to reverse interview us here, what's your answer to that question first?
Probably my best nugget of advice is your superpower when you're learning are really just the people around you. And so I went to the meetups. I listened to a couple people that have done something similar. They were said, hey, go to the meetup, go to the hack night, go talk to people, go learn something, and go to the talks. Even if you have no clue what they're talking about, go to the talks and just be around people, meet people. It may be easier, maybe harder to do now that we're mostly remote online versus, when I was going through that, there was a lot of in-person events in my town. Now, I think it's even easier to get on a meetup with a bunch of people because it's remote if that works out for you. But your community is really like a hugely undervalued resource for learning. And that's how I was able to get connected with the right resources to go in a direction that really worked for me when people offer to help you take their help.
Environment is huge. That's one of the other things that I've focused on very intentionally. There are always windows of opportunity that are opening. Sometimes you have to be patient for them to open, but they'll open. One of the big things that I've personally done is jumped on as many of those as I can. I see a lot of people who typically don't do that. Not because they're not looking to do what's best for themselves. It's the opposite. The window of opportunity usually comes with some risk behind it. It depends on what that is, but it might involve taking a pay cut to go do something. It might involve switching industries to do something. It might involve doing something on the side where you have to give up a substantial portion of your personal time to go do something without getting paid for it. That's actually one of the big ones that I see. I get a lot of people of, I don't want to contribute this thing back to this open source project because my work's not paying me for it, or I'm not going to get paid to do it. Or I don't want to invest this time doing X project because I want to go do, whatever that's going to entertain me on the side instead. Doing that's not fun, so I don't want to do it. I see a lot of that kind of stuff come up. That's taking yourself out of the right environment if you want to succeed in that self-taught engineering route or self-taught anything route. You've got to run through that litmus test of, is this opportunity going to help me get to where I want to go, even though I'm going to have to sacrifice something else to get there? So the more of those things that you can take that help get you where you want to go, the sooner you're going to get there, right? The other part that ties into that a lot for me is project, specifically side project. So what are you working on that you're funding, that you're putting your time into, that you're personally invested in, that you're personally interested in? And that last one is the big one, personally interested in. What are you doing there that ties back in to bettering yourself? And that's another one of those things. It's going to take your time, it's going to take your money, and it's probably going to take a good chunk of it, of both. And it's being willing to sit down and do that kind of thing that will also help you in the self-taught route. But the other really cool thing about it that you don't typically get if you're not going the self-taught route is you get a tangible artifact out of the end of it. You end up with something that you can physically show people, and specifically that you can go show an employer. That's something that I see discarded a lot. Like, people discard the value of that. Not the employers, they value that. But engineers will typically go, I don't want to do it, because you see this on the internet all the time too when you look at this. And I've seen this coaching people or giving advice or even just reading through people's resumes and stuff when they're applying for jobs. Folks will say, I don't want to do a project because it's going to take too much time and whatever, and it's not really going to make me stand out. Or the other thing is they'll say, it's too expensive, or if it's going to take too much time or whatever, they'll come up with some kind of excuse. You don't even have to typically get to the end of the side project as long as you can articulate what you learned out of it. You can have a lot of side projects that don't end up succeeding. That's one of those valuable things is, here's project X. This is why I did it, the problem it solved. Here are some of the approaches I took behind it. Here's how I worked on building it. And this is what I learned. That is very valuable to an employer. That'll really set you, aside. And that's another thing that it shows you're actually interested in what they're going to pay you to do too.
I think there's one more side to that too, which is in the process of building your own project, you could also potentially build something that is independently of value that may just be something that you want to pursue as a project that could be viable. And that is another really important reason to kind of base what you're working on out of something that you're interested in.
Absolutely.
I'll definitely ditto projects. That's something that I did when I was first starting and first learning things. It's what drove me to find solutions, to figure out how to do things. But in general, find something that interests you, figure out how to build it. Another thing is find people with similar interests and jam together on a toy project. That'll also help you figure out how to work with others and the path to building something together. Something that has definitely helped me a whole lot as I was starting is do a lot of source code reading and explore low-level stuff. Kernel, driver development, reverse engineering. These are some of the best things to do to learn how very low-level stuff works.
So jamming on a project with people for fun is definitely one good approach. There's another that I see that's very overlooked as well. And that's reaching out to folks in the open source community and helping out with one of those projects. And I think that's something that is an intimidating thing to do for newer people, but it can also be a really good way to learn. And now I'll say this, what you don't want to do is be the person who says, oh, I have this great idea for this new feature, this thing they need to add to it. And I'm going to spend a couple months just hacking on this in my little programming cave here. And I'm going to push this pull request out and everything's just going to be great. And they're just going to magically accept it and everything's going to be fine. And oh, this is going to be wonderful. And then as a junior engineer, I'm going to have this cool open source contribution under my belt. And yeah, it's not going to work that way. You're probably going to get your PR rejected. And then you're going to go, oh, well, no, they rejected my PR. I'm never going to put time into this again. And that's also the wrong way to look at it. So a lot of folks are intimidated by going down that route. But the couple that I have seen go down that route without guidance typically run into that wall where it's like, oh, my pull request got rejected or my thing, whatever. The maintainer didn't like it. So I'm not going to do it again. I'm just going to go work on my side project and I'll open source something of my own and everyone can contribute to that. And then I can go yell at people and close their PRs and stuff. So, you see those folks that are, come back at it kind of bitter and stuff like that. But that's where they didn't learn the real takeaway, that social takeaway. And that goes back to the working with people route. The right way to approach that type of situation is go in, not just looking to what you contribute, but sometimes just ask. Open source maintainers of the big projects have way more on their plate than they can handle typically. And so if you're able to go in there and take some of that load off them, even if it's just a really tiny amount, it's very helpful. You're also learning how to work with people. You're learning how to work with the open source community, which is incredibly valuable because that works in a different way than typically programming professionally. You can't really fire anybody in the open source community, right? And you can't motivate anybody with money because everybody gets paid the same, nothing. There's a different dynamic there. But to go back to one of the things that you were saying, John, that ties into is that's a great way to start getting mentorship while also giving something back. You're taking somebody's knowledge, but you're helping give them some of their time back.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's a quote similar to that that's like, people may not remember all the details, but they will remember how you made them feel. And open source is one of those places where you can exercise emotional intelligence, which I think is actually pretty hard to do online sometimes because you're mostly interacting with text. I've seen a lot of love, I guess, being showed in the open source community. And, the currency is issues and pull requests and comments and bug reports and things like that. But I think this sort of idea that you have to be sort of like a rogue 10x developer cutting a PR up against like a big important library is kind of the misnomer, that you might think that that's a good way to go. Maybe if you're in a vacuum and you don't necessarily have people to bounce the ideas off of and talk to. The discussion starts organically, whether like you find a bug, right? And then it's like, I think I know how to fix it. You could end up in a conversation that will actually put you in that same scenario you imagined, but you're better equipped to actually engage in the community and have your code committed.
Yeah, totally. There's something else I think that's important too when it comes to open source for people to think about as well, and especially early in their careers or programming experience. And that's at those earlier levels, you spend a whole lot of time consuming information, knowledge, libraries. A lot of the libraries that you'll use in your projects are going to be open source. You spend a lot of time basically taking from people. And you need to do that as you're at the bottom of that learning curve and you're getting up it. But there's going to be a point where you start hitting diminishing returns on that curve. And essentially, this comes down to start thinking about what you want to be like as a senior engineer. And when you get there, how are you going to behave? How are you going to act? How are you going to reverse that taking? How are you going to start giving back to your community? How are you going to start giving back to code, contributing code, or whatever? And so open source is one of those ways to do that. That's one of those ways to help give back to the code that you've been taking to bootstrap your career.
Yeah. And I'd plus one and say by the time you're at that point, it's also a good time to kind of like make room in your personal life or a little bit in your professional life to mentor another person.
Absolutely. That's exactly a good example of another one of those ways to give back. So, John, we've covered a lot here. Do you have any other words of wisdom or advice that you want to leave people with?
I think maybe like my favorite thing that you touched on from today was like kind of a combination, right? About having discipline and also being able to sort of make a plan. And I would say if the self-taught route seems appealing to you, one, it's really hard. Don't mistake that it's a very hard path. But I think as someone who's been on that, I would also say you're not alone and find your people. And it can also be incredibly rewarding.
That is great advice. Thank you very much for joining us today, John. And for the rest of you, we'll catch you next time on the next episode of Full Stack Engineering.